Hi, I'm Marius from MWS Photography and welcome back to another episode of Digital Photography Today, the show where you will learn how to become the master of your camera. Today's topic is the big one, it's manual exposure. And we're also going to talk about the exposure triangle because it's very important that you understand the exposure triangle. It's going to really help you a lot when you work with manual exposure. But before we kick off the show, this morning when I checked Google Analytics, I saw that I've now got 2014 subscribers, 2014 subscribers. So I'm really happy about that. It's awesome. I can really see the show is growing and it's all thanks to you guys because you are watching my show, leaving comments, enjoying the episodes, and it's just awesome. So I want to give a big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And I also want to ask that if you love the show, go on social media, share the news, tell people, okay, you've got a camera, go watch the show. Because I'm really trying to reach as many people, to show people that you can really do awesome stuff with a Canon Powershot or with a Nikon bridge camera or a Sony or a Fuji bridge camera, no matter what you've got, or even an entry-level SLR. Really, a camera is a camera. So I want to show people it's not the gear. This is what you can do. You must just understand your camera. So I'm trying to reach as many people as I can, but it's up to you guys to let the show grow and become totally awesome. So if you like it, go on Facebook, share the link. People go watch this, it'll change your life. Or go on Google Plus and whatever, Twitter it, just get the news out. Because I really want the show to go viral so it can just grow and become better and better and I can get better content out to everyone. So now we're going to kick off the show. We're going to discuss first, before we look at the exposure triangle, we're first going to discuss why you would want to use manual exposure. Then we're going to look at the exposure triangle. And then we're going to go to the camera, the Canon Powershot, the Nikon D3100, and we're going to look on the camera how to set the camera in manual and how to properly look for your exposure when you're doing that. Okay, now you might have asked yourself, why would you want to use manual? Because we already learned that program is the better auto. We could achieve a lot of cool effects with our shutter speed in shutter priority. And then we also learned in aperture priority, we can really control depth of field and the camera does the other half of the equation for you. So why then would you want to use manual? Okay, there are times, for instance, when I'm doing a shoot somewhere, I might be in a forest, there's lots of tricky lighting going on. I want to keep a consistent exposure. Then I can go in manual, and no matter how I move my camera, the light that's in this forest coming through the trees and all, it doesn't affect my exposure. The camera doesn't try to adjust for the light that's now lighter, darker as I move my camera within the forest. The exposure stays the same and I've set it on the camera. Maybe you're taking a picture of something that's very backlit. So the sun is behind someone and it's making a person look like a silhouette. So with this, I can tell the camera, well, overexpose, because I know what I want to have. I don't want the person to be a silhouette. If you want a silhouette, then fine. But if you don't want a silhouette, you can overexpose. You can tell the camera, well, I'm overexposing now. I don't care what you think the right exposure is. I'm doing what I want to do on the camera. And another one which is really important, and I've helped tons of people locally here in Cape Town that has studios, and then they didn't know that you need to shoot in manual when you're doing studio photography. So you can't shoot in TV or AV, and I'm going to tell you why. When you are taking a picture, say for instance now I've got in here video lights that's turned on. So if I'm going to focus with the camera now, the camera's going to read the light that's in the room. It's going to meter that light. And I'll be able to take a picture for the light that's in this room. Now what happens when you are taking a picture in a studio? Now for instance, here I've got a studio light. Now if I turn the light on, when I'm taking a picture, which light is going to take the picture? The lighting that's on in the room here, or when I press the test button, don't know if you can see the flash, I might as well just turn it this way. Usually you don't always see a flash pick up on a camera, so I'm going to do it a few times, but you can hear the peeping sound. There you could hopefully see the flash go off. Here it is again. So when I'm taking a picture, and about this is called a beauty dish. It's an accessory in the studio. Now, when I take a picture, I'm going to use that flashlight to take the picture. Now, does the camera know that I'm going to take a picture with this amount of flash power? And I can adjust the power here at the back as well. The camera doesn't know that. So if you're in program TV or AV or aperture or shutter, the camera's going to read the light that's in this room, that's on, the ambient light. So when you take the picture, it's going to be weird because you're either going to overexpose it or the shutter's going to be very long and you're going to have blurry pictures. It's just going to look terrible. So when I'm shooting in the studio, I don't have video lights on like I've got now. So I will turn, for instance, this light on. Now this is a modeling lamp. And if you can't see it properly because of the honeycomb grid on the front, if I turn it like this, you should properly see the light there on the inside. This is so that I can see what I'm taking a picture of. So if I'm taking a picture in the studio, it's only going to be this light and maybe the softbox or the snoot or whatever accessory I've got turned on. It's those lights that are going to be on. So if I'm in any other mode except for manual, the camera is going to read this light, and when the flash goes off, it's going to be overexposed or the shutter speed is going to be terribly long. So when I'm shooting in manual, I tell the camera, okay, I want to have this ISO, I want to have this shutter speed, and I want to have this aperture, and don't change it. So every picture I'm going to take, no matter how I move the camera, it's all going to be consistent because the lighting is set on my flash units, on my studio lights, it's set, and the camera is set, so it doesn't change. You get consistency. So that's why you would want to use manual. That's just two quick examples. Why you would want to use manual. It's when your lighting is tricky, or if you just want a shot that the camera does not want to give you, then you go to manual. Okay, now we're going to discuss the exposure triangle. Now manual exposure is actually really very easy to do. You're actually going to go, when you look on your screen, when you watch this video and see, it's that easy? Like really? Now why didn't you just show it to me on episode number 1? The reason for that is you need a proper foundation to really use manual exposure successfully. That's why I showed you shutter speeds on its own, aperture on its own episode, and also ISO on its own episode. So you can properly understand what your shutter does, what your aperture does, and what your ISO does. If you understand what they do, you can properly set it on the camera. If you don't, you're just going to try and use the exposure line that's on your camera. I'm going to show it to you soon. To get the exposure to what the camera says is right, which is not always right. I'm going to talk about that as well. So you're going to try and get the exposure to what the camera says it should be, but you don't really know why you chose this shutter speed. Why am I using this aperture? I don't know. I'm just doing it because the camera says it's happy now. So you're not really going to get the results that you want. Okay, so when we look at the exposure triangle, you're going to see on the screen here that there is, at the top of the triangle, we've got our ISO. Then we're at the bottom, we've got our aperture, and we've got our shutter. Now, if you have not yet seen the episode on shutter speeds in detail, click the link and watch that video. Trust me, it will really help you a lot to better understand what your shutter speed does, because you're going to need that knowledge to use it when you are doing your manual exposure. If you haven't seen the video on aperture, also now click that link, watch that video, and learn about the depth of field that you're going to achieve when you're using your aperture, because your shutter speeds are going to work with movement and your aperture is going to work with your depth of field. Okay, then your ISO, if you haven't seen that video, also click the link and watch what your ISO does, because your ISO is your light sensitivity of your camera's sensor. Okay, now when we look at this exposure triangle, you're going to see at the bottom with the shutter and the aperture, those two always have to work together. If you watch the previous videos, you will notice that when we set the shutter speed in, for instance, TV or S on the Nikon camera and TV on the Canon camera, when we adjusted the shutter speed, we achieved the effect of movement. So we could either freeze a subject or we could show movement of the subject. So we could control the duration of time that's allowed when you take the picture. So we could take a picture for maybe 1 second, so you could hear the camera go chick, 1 second, chick. So all the movements within that time frame, the camera captured those movements. You could also freeze the action. So that we can do with our shutter. Now when we changed our shutter speed, we noticed that the camera did the aperture for us. So you'll notice on the exposure triangle, those two at the bottom, they work together. So when you change the shutter, the camera automatically changed the aperture for you. When we then worked in aperture priority, we set the amount of depth of field that we want. So if we used a very small aperture number, which was a very large aperture opening, as you saw on the aperture video, we will have a very little amount of depth of field, very shallow. So if you take, for instance, a picture of a flower, you could take a picture of this flower and blur everything behind the flower. If you want to take a landscape, you would use something like f16, f22, or something along those range, because the larger the f-stop number goes, the more deeper depth of field you will get. So by doing aperture, we learned that we could control the depth of field with the camera, and then when we used aperture, the camera automatically changed the shutter speed for us. So that those two work together. Now the ISO at the top, it doesn't really need to change. If you now decide for the rest of your life you are going to use ISO 100, get the best quality pictures and never change it, it's going to be your loss, trust me. ISO is really powerful and it's your best buddy if you know how to use it, and especially in low light or if you want to have faster shutter speeds. Your ISO is really very handy for that, and we will see soon when we look on the camera how to do the settings. You'll notice how powerful ISO can be. Okay, so the ISO doesn't need to change, but when you change the ISO, it will affect the shutter and the aperture, because those two continuously work together. So if you set the shutter and the aperture, for instance, maybe your ISO is on 100 and you've set your shutter and your aperture, the moment you change the ISO, your shutter and aperture will need to change again. Otherwise, the camera will be overexposed or over or underexposed, depending on the settings you've got or the ISO you've chosen. So those three work together, and those are the three that we are going to set now on the camera. We are going to use those three. Okay, let's first start with the Canon Powershot SX50HS. For my setup, I've taken a cross. You might remember this from the Canon Powershot SX50HS review I shot. This was the image I did in the studio with this camera. So yeah, I've taken the same cross and I just put it on a wine rack thingy. And then for the lighting, I've taken one of my studio lights and I'm using the modeling lamp inside with barn doors to create that red light in the background. I'm only using this because I've got it. You can use anything. Take a lamp with a lampshade and just put cellophane around it, and there you've got your instant red light or blue light, whatever light you want to create. And then for the light in the front to shine on the cross, I'm using a video LED panel. So again, you can use anything around the house. I'm only using this because I've got it. So there's no excuses. You can practice, right? So look for objects around the house. And then when we look at the settings on the back of the camera, you can see that I am on manual or must use, as they call it. Then you can see at the bottom here I've got my shutter speed. Now sometimes if I move the camera slightly, you can see it's jumping around. It's because I'm zoomed in at 50% optical. So I'm zoomed in all the way. I'm quite a distance away from this cross. Okay, so here I've got my shutter speed and here I've got my aperture. To change my shutter speed, I just turn this wheel right here. You can see the shutter speed is changing. You'll also notice, very nice, this camera, the live view is showing me everything that's happening. If I want to change, say, the aperture, I just press this plus minus block right here. You might remember that from the exposure compensation video. So you can also click the link to watch that one. We're not exposure compensating really. This button has just done the camera to switch over to aperture, as you can see right there. Basically, when you are in manual, you are compensating for the camera the entire time. So it's exposure compensation 24 hours a day. Okay, so when I turn this wheel now, it's going to turn the aperture side right here. Right. So on this section right here, at the bottom, you can see right there, ISO 200, that's my ISO. And remember the exposure triangle? We've got shutter, we've got aperture, and we've got ISO. To change the ISO, there's an ISO button right here. Press the ISO button, again, turn the wheel, and then you can see the ISO running. Now, a lower ISO will give you a darker image, because remember, the ISO is the light sensitivity of the camera sensor. So the more I increase the ISO, you'll see there, the more light I allow to come into the camera. This is so easy when you're working with this camera because you can see everything happening. So this is your light sensitivity, your ISO. Okay, now very, very important, this line right here, that's your exposure meter or your exposure line. That's very important because you need to look at that line to see where your exposure is. For instance, in the middle, you'll see right there, there's like a thick bar in the middle. That is basically 0. That is what the camera says is the perfect exposure. And I'm going to show you that the camera's perfect is not always perfect. It's what you want from the picture that's going to be perfect. So I'm going to show you how to adjust the picture for what you want to have. Okay, so in the middle is what the camera meters as perfect exposure. When you go up this line to there, you are going to the plus side. So if I now, for instance, I'm just going to go over to shutter speed. If I make the shutter speed slower, you're going to see that line running up. So if we go to say there, you'll notice the image is completely washed out because I've overexposed it. If I take the shutter speed again and I make it faster, you're going to see it's moving down the line because I'm increasing my speed. I'm letting less light in. So you can see the image is going darker. So this is very important. You need to look at this line the entire time so that you know where your exposure is. But again, it makes it very easy on this camera because you can see it at the back. Okay, so let's take the shutter speed to where the camera says it's perfectly happy. Let's take it to the middle. Okay, so if I make the shutter speed slower to there, that's what the camera says is perfect. Now for me, the background looks good, but the cross is a little bit too bright. I would prefer it a little darker. So let's take this image, but notice our shutter speed is very slow. So I'm going to turn on the self timer. Of course, we're zoomed in all the way. The slightest movements will give us image blur. So I'm going to turn the 2-second self timer on. I'm going to focus and I'm going to shoot. It'll just eliminate the movement when I press down on the camera, because remember, when you press down on the camera, you move the camera. Okay, so if we go to the preview, we can see the image is nice and sharp. If we actually did this without the self timer, I'll show you. If we take the self timer off, and the self timer is right there. If I take the self timer off and I take the same picture, you'll see that when we look at it, you can see it's a little bit blurry. It's because we had movement even while we are on the tripod. It just helps to either use a cable or to use the self timer once your shutter speeds are going really slow. Okay, now say I decided I would prefer to take this image a little darker because the cross for me is a little bit too bright. This is now very easy. I can just make the shutter speed a little faster. So now we've got the shutter speed right there. I can make it a little faster, and you'll notice that line going to the minus side. So I want to take the shot, say at that point right there. I'm just going to turn on the self timer again. Of course, the shutter speed is still very slow. I'm going to focus and I'm going to shoot. So if we take this image, if we take this one and you compare it to this one, you'll notice the cross is much brighter on this one. This one, it's a little bit darker. I haven't seen it now on the back of the computer screen because I'm not really viewing the pictures on the Canon Powershot. I'm looking at the camera. I'm looking on the screen of the camera that's behind the Powershot. So for me, it's actually pretty tricky to see if everything is really in focus. But I'm believing it is. I'm positive. Okay, so say that we want to take this picture at a 60th of a second. We would prefer to have it handheld. We don't have a tripod. Now, okay, the camera is on a tripod now, but it's only for me to record the video with. Say you're outside, you don't have a tripod. What can you do? Okay, I can take my shutter speed to say around a 60th. Now you'll see this camera's got an image stabilizer as well. If I focus now halfway, it's not giving me a warning sign. Usually it gives me there warning signs. If I go slower, you'll see it's telling me, okay, just turn the self timer off. You'll see it usually if you go very slow, it gives you a warning sign right there. It's flickering in the corner. So when I'm at a 60th of a second, you'll notice the image is very dark, but I do not get that bar right there telling me, that flickering thing, that the image is going to be shaky. So now we need to fix this shot because of course we can see we're now at the desired shutter speed. That's why I first covered shutter speeds and then aperture and then ISO. I think I covered ISO before shutter and aperture. I covered them separately so you can have a starting point, that you know why you're choosing a specific shutter speed. I'm choosing this shutter speed so that I can have a sharp image without using a tripod. Okay, now I need to get more light in, and I can do this two ways because the image is now completely underexposed. I can either open up the aperture because the aperture is now at 7.1, which means the aperture is smaller. If I make that number smaller, the aperture will go larger. So I'm going to go here to that plus minus block, and I'm going to press that. Then I'm going to go to 6.5, and you'll notice on the bridge camera, there's not really a lot of flexibility here. So I'm just going to go to the smallest I've got, and that's 6.5. It didn't really help that much, but we gained a little. Okay, then we can still use our ISO. The ISO will give us a lot more light. I'm just going to turn this video light a little bright on the camera. So I'm thinking you might not be able to have seen all those buttons. I'm sorry for my hand coming in here, which is blocking the video light. Okay, so if I press the ISO button, you'll notice as I increase the ISO, you can see more light there on the picture. So I can maybe decide, let's use eyes of 2000, let's see where the exposure is. Okay, the exposure is almost where I had it. It's now at one full stop underexposed. I'm still happy with that. But now I can take this image handheld, I could just focus and shoot. And it's a darker exposure than what the camera would have given me. So I can now take the preview, I can zoom in, you can see the image is nice and sharp. And this was taken handheld. So when you're taking pictures, you can decide what your starting point may be. Maybe you want to have an image taken at exactly 200th of a second because you've got a moving object. I don't have a moving object here, but say I did have a moving object. I could decide I want to have 200. And then I could also use my ISO and go as high as I need to get that shutter speed. But say I was outside and there was enough light, then I didn't really need to have such a high ISO. I'm just throwing ideas here so that you can see how you adjust this in manual. You can decide how you want to take this picture. If I take, I'm just going to get up here and I'm going to turn off the LED light that's on the cross. Let's do this. And you're going to see that the cross is now completely a silhouette. Now, if I take the shutter speed, I'm now going to make the shutter speed a little slower. That is what the camera says is right, because we've got that now exactly there in the middle. That's what the camera says is right. Now, if I want the cross to be even darker, or I want the background to be, I want the cross to be dark and I want the background in the back to be more saturated in red, I can just underexpose. If I overexpose, it's going to get brighter. So if I underexpose, it's going to get darker. So let's take a picture right here on a 20th of a second, and you'll see this is what the background looks like. Now, if I make the shutter speed, I'm going to compare those two now. If I make the shutter speed faster, to say a 60th, or let's make it a 50th, and I take the exact same shot again, okay, we're actually almost on tripod territory or self-timer territory, as you can see with that thing flickering. Okay, so if I compare these two, this is the one which the camera said is spot on right. This is the one that I made darker. So if you look at it, you'll see that my red background is just more darker and saturated. And the cross is also more silhouette. So you've really got so much flexibility when you are shooting manual. And the nice thing about manual is once you've dialed in your settings, for instance, if I go back to my screen here, once I've chosen a 50th of a second at f6.5 at ISO 2000, this will not change. It will stay on these settings until you change it again. That makes consistency very nice. So if I'm working in a studio environment, I know that's not necessarily where you are yet. Hopefully my series of videos will get you there. But if you are working in a studio environment, you want consistency from picture to picture. If you are taking nature images outside, you want consistency. So for me, it's very important to then work in manual. But yes, I do use AV and TV or shutter and aperture from time to time when I do want it. It just helps me to work a lot quicker, to focus on maybe the object or the subject matter instead of looking at settings the entire time. But other times where I need consistency, I will focus on the settings, and then I will do that in manual. So let's go over to the Nikon D3100 and let's look at the settings for this exact same image. Okay, before we start on the Nikon D3100, I just want to make a very important point. These are all just camera settings. We are working with the exposure triangle. It's shutter, aperture and ISO. If you don't have a SX50HS or a Nikon D3100, you don't need to go buy one to use these settings. You can use any camera. As long as it's got a manual mode, you can apply these settings. If I get a brand new camera, the buttons are usually changed around. I look at the camera, okay, this button is now here, this button is now here, and then I use the camera because I've got a solid foundation for shutter, aperture and ISO. I've learned how to use my camera. So if I get a new camera, I just continue to use that knowledge. So no matter what camera you've got, start to practice today so that you can become the master of your camera. Okay, now on this camera, you'll notice here on the D3100, at the top you can see here I'm on manual mode. If I go to live view, you can see what I'm seeing. I'm just going to turn on this video light that we had previously on with the Canon Powershot. So there you can see what I'm seeing. through the camera. You'll also notice if I go back to live view and I change the shutter, you can see right here in the bottom. If I change the shutter, it does not change the picture. So we do not have that same live view that was on the Canon Powershot, which is actually sad because I love that, that you can see everything changing. Okay, the settings we've got here, you'll notice are inside your viewfinder. So with an SLR camera, you don't use this all the time. That's more for your point and shoot and bridge cameras. You work with the viewfinder in here. It's much better quality. You are seeing what the lens is seeing. So these settings I'm changing here is also on the inside. That's why with the SLR, you can just have the camera you just look through the camera and you shoot. You don't have to look on the back of the screen. Okay, so where are the settings on this camera? Here you can see my shutter, here you can see my aperture. When I turn this dial right here, so if I turn this dial, you'll see the shutter speed moving. If I want to change the aperture, there is that plus minus from the Canon Powershot is right here at the top. So if I press it down and I turn this wheel again, you will see the aperture is moving, and you'll notice small aperture number, large aperture opening. Larger f-stop number, smaller aperture opening. So just remember that reverse thing happening right there. Okay, so this is your aperture, and then your ISO is right there. If you press the info button, you're going to see, and it also shows your exposure meter right here. I'm going to talk about that now. So if you press OK here, you've got pictures showing you the ISOs and when usually you would want to use them. Okay, so when I go back to the main screen, you'll see right here I have got an exposure line that was on the Canon Powershot in this corner right here. And you've got your middle point, which the camera says is right. So if I make my shutter speed slower, you'll notice I'm going to the middle, and that is what the camera says is the proper exposure for this image. You've got your plus this side, so this is when you are overexposing. You've got your minus that side, that's when you are underexposing. So it's very similar. Like I said, it's all just camera settings. For instance, if I want to take this picture now to what the camera says is right, I'm going to turn the self timer on, which is right here at the top. I just take the slider and I just slide it down. You can see there the self timer turns on. Because it's a half a second exposure, so I'm just going to let the self timer do its thing. Right, so with this now, this is what the camera says it's right. It shifted a little bit there. It went to just below the perfect exposure. But if I zoom in, this is what the camera says is the proper exposure. It's not bad at all. But so I wanted to underexpose it a little, I can just increase my shutter speed. So let's say I want to shoot it one stop overexposed. So there we've got one stop and two stops. The same as with that -1 and -2 that we had on the Canon Powershot. So there we've got one stop. Okay, the lighting is shifting around a bit, so it's jumping around there. It's fine. So there we go. If we go faster than this, we can shoot without the self timer. So there we're shooting it much darker, and I prefer this. It just looks a lot better. And the background as well, I like the more darker red. Now say that I want to shoot this image now exactly like this, but I want to have a 60th of a second because I'm now shooting this handheld. So I'm turning off the self timer. I don't have the self timer, as you can see there at the top. It's on single shot. Okay, so if I take my shutter speed to a 60th, there we've got a 60th, you're going to see the image is completely underexposed. If I take a picture of this to show you what the camera is now seeing, you'll notice the picture is completely underexposed. So we've got two ways that we can work on this. We can either change our aperture, but now because the lens is zoomed in all the way, I'm stuck at f5.6. You'll notice I can go larger with the number, but I can't go smaller. So I know my f-stop will not help me in this regard. I need to use my buddy system, Mr. ISO. I'm going to go to info here. I'm going to press OK. And I'm going to go down with the ISO and see what ISO 800 does, 600, 1600. You can see it's starting. Okay, there we've got one stop underexposed. So now I can take the exact same shot at a 60th of a second, f5.6, but I've changed my ISO to 1600, which was at 100. So if I focus now and I shoot, we've got the exact same shot that's underexposed by a stop, but we did it handheld without a self-timer, or it was on a tripod now, but if you did it handheld, it would be exactly the same. Okay, so it's very easy to change your settings in a manual mode. I'm not going to do everything I did on the Canon Powershot now because it's all the same. It's just settings. I'm just showing you what it looks like on the SLR camera as well. So now you need to go look for an object at home, grab a light. It can be a lampshade, put a piece of cellophane, colored cellophane around it, make a background like I did, use a flashlight in the front of your subject, maybe more flashlights, and create some awesome lighting, and do a nice still life, or have something that's moving and take it outside and use different shutter speeds on it, but do it in manual. And remember the three magic words: practice, practice, and practice. If you do that, you will become comfortable with manual and you will start to get consistent results. So that's manual on the Nikon D3100. Okay, that's all for manual exposure. And was I right when I said it's really very easy? The moment you understand your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO, your exposure triangle, once you've got that foundation properly set, then using manual really is not that tricky. Now, if you're really hungry for more manual madness, then go have a look on the MWest website. Under shop, you're going to find painting with light. We again look at manual exposure in that video, but for the purpose of doing long exposures, and I'd show you how to paint with light, and how to, or which lights you need, how to use the lights, how to set up the camera, etc, 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 all in those videos. So go have a look. You can see the pictures that was taken on that series of videos flashing over the screen. Go have a look at that. It's still on special on the website. Then, if you have any photographic questions or camera related questions, please send them to askmwest@mwest.co.za, and I will try to answer them for you in a future episode of Digital Photography Today. Then, we are at 2,000 subscribers. We need more subscribers. We need to reach 10,000 before the end of next month. I don't think it's going to happen, but you never know. Go viral and Facebook it, and let's see if we can get that subscriber base to really increase. So if you love the show, if you haven't yet subscribed, click the subscribe button. It will make your life better. Okay, so that's all for this week's episode. Next week's episode you also don't want to miss. I've had a ton of questions from people that they don't know which mode to shoot in. They now know how to use TV, they know how to use AV or aperture and shutter, but they don't know which mode to go to when I want to take a specific picture. Now, I waited with this episode until we've finished the manual exposure. So next week, we're going to discuss, I'm going to show some pictures, we're going to look at some scenarios that if you're out and taking pictures, which mode do you use? Where do you start? Because you need that starting point. The same today with manual. You need a starting point. You need to know where to start. You need to know, okay, this is speed I want to work with, so I'm going to go to TV, or I'm going to go to S, or I want to work with depth of field here, so I'm going to go to AV. So we're going to discuss all that in next week's episode. So see you then. Bye.